Hi, everyone. This is Jaime Alejandro, and welcome to the Arts Calling Podcast, where I interview hardworking independent creatives in the literary, visual, and performing arts. We have a great episode lined up, but before I get started, I just want to give myself a quick shout out. I know it is almost the end of January, but I have a new tab of updates over at cruisefolio.com. There's a quick link at the very top of this episode. Go ahead and check it out. There's some new stuff happening, including a brand new publication. I have a piece of flash fiction over at Barrel House, thanks to the great editor, curator, and author herself, Ofelia Montelongo, who put together an amazing issue for the Latine Monsters issue over at Barrel House. So I hope that you folks check it out. I'm really proud of that piece, and it's a good way to start the year. So with that said, let me take a minute to introduce our guest. Today, I am arts calling Tyler C. Gore. Tyler is the author of My Life of Crime, Essays and Other Entertainments, shortlisted for the Eric Hoffer Book Award Grand Prize. My Life of Crime was also a First Horizon Award Finalist and appeared in the Independent Book Review's list of impressive indie books of 2022. Tyler has been cited 5 times as a notable essayist by the Best American Essays annual anthology and is the recipient of a Fulbright Scholarship for creative writing. For many years, he served as art director of Literal Latte and currently serves on the editorial boards of Exacting Clam and StatORec. His essays, stories, and reviews have appeared in many of the fine, high-quality journals preferred by discerning readers like you. He lives as he dreams in Brooklyn. This was such a delightful conversation with Tyler that I just thought it would set the tone perfectly for 2024. It was a conversation about life-affirming moments, about gathering the stories and memories of the past and turning them into something that is truly exciting and in the now, as his collection was. It's very funny, so I hope that you check it out. It is now available from Sagging Meniscus Press, and I have the link in the episode description. So without further delay, let's give Tyler a call. Hello, is anybody there?
Hi, Jaime.
Hello, Tyler. How are you? Hey.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Good to meet you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, happy belated New Year, I should say.
Yeah. Happy New Year to you, too.
How's it been over there in your neck of the woods?
Well, it's currently snowing right now.
Oh, really? Where are you at?
I'm in Brooklyn, and this is basically yesterday was the first snow of this winter. And I think last winter we didn't have any.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's kind of surprising. I think we're getting less and less snow. I'm over in Wyoming, so there's, not a lot going on, which is surprising. Normally we're kind of covered up at this point. Well, Tyler, thanks a bunch for your time. I'm so excited to get to meet you and learn a bit more about you and your work. So you're in Brooklyn, you said?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I live in Brooklyn, and I've been in New York City almost all of my adult life.
Yeah. I wonder what that kind of experience is like growing up in a hustle bustle sort of thing, because I'm kind of in the middle of nowhere, so I have no real sense of what that experience is like. What was it for you, if you can look back and give me a bit of that?
Well, actually, so I was born in New York, but I didn't grow up here. I grew up in the suburbs of New Jersey, just outside of New York City, maybe about a half an hour outside of New York City. So New York City was always the city for me. That's what everybody calls it. It's just the city. And when I was about 23, like in the early 90s, I moved here. And for the most part, I've been here ever since.
Oh, that's fascinating.
In New York City.
So when did you find writing? Was it something that came to you fairly quickly in your life, or did you kind of stumble into it later on, or what was the beginning of that for you?
So I always was interested in writing. I think because I was really a big reader as a kid. My mom taught me how to read very early before I was even in school. We had a lot of books in the house. Both my parents were big readers. So I read all the time as a kid, for recreation. And out of that, as I said to somebody else, I think reading is the gateway drug for writing. So, when you read a lot, you want to write. And so, I've always been writing. I was an English major in college. And in the book that I have out now, My Life of Crime, those are personal essays, and I began writing those about quite a while ago in the 90s, where I had a column for a small magazine in Long Island, and I just began writing these personal essays, and I found that genre really suited me.
Mm. And so was it a difficult discovery, or it seemed like pretty early on you had more of an intuition to go into memoir or essay, perhaps opinion writing? Is that accurate?
Yeah, my stuff is not so much, I mean, it's opinionated, but it's not opinion. Like it's really memoir. These are stories about my life. I'm kind of adjacent to somebody like David Sedaris, or maybe David Foster Wallace's essays, where I'm writing about me in my life. They're generally humorous. And I think for me, the way I began to feel comfortable with that form is to learn how to write in a way that feels like I'm conversing with somebody, like I'm telling you a story. Because this kind of writing, it's not journalism, it's not an opinion piece like a column on politics or something like that. But the kind of writing I do is more like you're hanging out with your friends and they want to tell you a funny story about what happened while they had jury duty or when they had their appendix removed, that kind of thing. So that's kind of the genre I work in. I also write fiction, but this has been the main genre I work in, and My Life of Crime is all memoir.
Mm. So when you were growing up, do you recall having these kinds of influences real time, like say David Foster Wallace or David Sedaris, or what were the works or the writers who were informing the way that you saw the world at that age when you were younger?
You mean as a kid or when I first began writing in the 90s? I was a
When you
young
first
adult.
began writing in the 90s.
Yeah. So, well, yeah, that's an interesting question. So, a writer that I mentioned in the introduction of this book that was really influential is a writer named Todd McEwen. He had a book that his first novel was published in the early 80s, and it was called Fisher's Hornpipe. It's not a personal essay, but his writing, his prose style was like electric for me. The way he just did things that I hadn't seen done before. And it had a kind of like, it's a very funny book. It just had a kind of, zany, like unhinged quality to it. And so I don't think I write like him, but he was an important influence on trying to find my own voice. So one of the essays in this collection is called Stuff, which is about my family's hoarding problem. And when I was writing Stuff while I was finishing my undergraduate degree in my late 20s at City College, and I had a deadline, and I kept going back to Todd McEwen's writing to be like, for inspiration, really, like, how can I capture this sort of angry, manic tone that I need to talk about my frustrations with all the stuff we have in the house? So that was an important influence. And then sometime later, somebody gave me a copy of David Sedaris's first book, which at that time, now he's one of the most famous writers writing, but at that time he was still sort of not so well known. He'd done some pieces on NPR. And so I read the Santaland Diaries, and that was also something. So I was already working in that genre and writing humorous pieces, but it was like, this guy is a great writer. So there's people like that. Yeah.
So it made it feasible for you to see a lane or some kind of pipeline toward something that felt true, more true than fiction, would you say, or something that you kind of balance together with fiction?
Um, yeah, more true than fiction is interesting. So memoir and personal essays are a weird thing to work in because it's your actual life, right? So there's a lot of the analogy I sometimes use is like the old timey strip dancers who used to have like the feathers and the boas, like 1940s, where there's a lot of illusion that you're seeing more than you really are. And so, you know, I have to show things about myself that are uncomfortable or embarrassing, but I kind of limit that, you know. And another sort of pitfall for memoir writers is that you have people in your life. All your stories are about people. But when you're writing memoir, these are real people. And it's very nice to have friends and people who like you. So you try to limit those things. And like in Appendix, for example, I changed the name of every doctor I encountered while I was having my appendix removed, things like that. So memoir is weird, where it's a lot like fiction, where you have to tell a story that's an engaging story, but at the same time, you have to navigate this weird relationship with this is my real life. And what I write here, people will read and know about my real life.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I think that would be a nice segue to specifically talk about My Life of Crime. Great title. And I love the second title here, which is Essays and Other Entertainments. I think it speaks to a lot of what you're referring to right now. But if we could talk about the genesis of this collection and specifically when you found that you had something that could become a collection of essays.
Yeah, so I've been writing these shorter memoirs that, they're very concise. And a lot of those were originally written for the column I had for a newspaper in Long Island. Then I was publishing in literary magazines, particularly Literal Latte. So I had this kind of body of these humorous essays about my life. And so I know the publisher of Sagging Meniscus, which is my press, Jacob Smolyan, and he approached me in the early days of the press, which is a few years ago, and said, I love your stuff. I'd like to put together a collection of your work. And I was like, great. I'm working on an essay right now about my appendix surgery. And I just would like to finish that to include that. So in this collection, that essay, appendix, is 2/3 of the book. It's basically a book. And I didn't know that when I told him, just let me finish that essay. At the time, it was like maybe 10, 15 pages long, and it wound up being book length. But he'd seen drafts of it, and he was like, just keep going, keep doing it. So I basically had a collection that he wanted to publish, and then I wrote a book that was included in the collection, which is appendix. So appendix is really the cornerstone. So that's how that came about. How this book came about was Sagging Meniscus's interest in my work, and then them indulging me with writing this book-length essay about my appendix surgery.
Oh, that's lovely. But it does set the tone, right? It feels like having that being the centerpiece of the collection kind of informed sort of the order of events in the collection, would you say?
Um, well, it's the last essay in there, which I think is kind of funny because it's named appendix. um, yeah, so in terms of if that's what you're asking, in terms of the way the collection is ordered, actually Jacob ordered that. So he put it in that order, and then I wrote an introduction for it as well. He's he's a very good publisher to have. So this is like Sagging Meniscus is an indie press, and he had a very light hand with editing. Like he's somebody who knows when to step in and when not to. And in fact, because some of these pieces were earlier pieces, I began revising some of them as we were getting close to publication. Some of those things were just typos or errors or things that had bothered me. But when I began doing some substantial revisions on an earlier piece, he immediately emailed me and said, "I want you to stop doing that right now. Do not do that." He was like, he's like, "They're perfect the way they are. Don't mess with it." And I was like, okay, I listened to him.
Yeah. I'm curious what you saw in those previous pieces that you felt needed adjusting versus what he saw, if you could. Yeah.
So I guess in one that comes to mind is the first essay in the collection, which is My Life of Crime. And that essay is about, it kind of revolves around the kind of pranks I did as a teenager growing up in the suburbs, ordering pizza for the neighbors. And then it kind of delves into, where I had a group of people, like high school students, friends of mine, good friends of mine, and there's some characterization of who we are. And then I began revising that more, where I was pulling in, it's difficult to explain, but more like our influences to try to explain who we were, like, punk and things like that. But all of that was already kind of in there without being explicit. And he was like, don't do that. It's fine the way you had it, where I was pulling in more specific references. I think that's in general a thing with writers. I'm sure you know this as a writer yourself, that you're never satisfied. You always want to revise, and it really it sometimes requires somebody else to like just pull it away from you and be like, stop doing that.
Yeah.
It's hard.
It must be such a gift to have somebody like your publisher who is offering the room. And I don't know how difficult it is in publishing to find a good collaborator like that, but it seems like the indie presses are really the way to go in terms of the freedom to really sculpt something in this way. Could you share a bit about that, how that relationship has informed this collection as it is now? I know we've kind of addressed it a bit, but I just feel like for a layperson like myself in publishing, which is something that I'm not too familiar with, the difference between the benefits of an indie press and the hardships and downsides of like major publication and what that's all about.
Right. So, I mean, this is my first book, so I only have experience with an indie press, but I have a lot of friends who are writers. So, some of them are quite successful. And since I've published this, I've become a lot more familiar with a lot of the different aspects of publishing. One of the things I would say about indie presses, and I've read a lot of books published by indie presses in the past year, is this is where real literature is taking place. The larger presses are largely driven by commercial interests. Not that they don't, not that there's not great literature being published by large presses. That's definitely true. But I think there's a lot more, they have a lot more commercial considerations. There's a lot more people involved. Indie presses, I feel on the whole, are about supporting a specific artist's vision. And so this is the place where people can do things that are experimental, unusual, like including in a collection of essays, an essay that's book length, or even the other entertainments of my collection, which are these three absurdist pieces, like a collection of recipes and things like that for deep fried cheesy snacks and things like that. This is the kind of thing with an indie press where it's really refreshing and exciting, where you're reading things that are less filtered from the artist and less tied to commercial trends going on. Publishers always have these what's the fashion of this year, what's really in trend. And so you're liberated from that. And thank God for indie presses.
Absolutely. Could I have you indulge me here and speak a little bit more about 3 international recipes? You mentioned absurdism in that piece,
Right.
and I'm really curious what you mean by that, and just as a personal interest of mine, because that's an interesting form to use as a way to share the message. If you could elaborate how that one came to be.
I think it was a long time ago. I was just sitting down reading recipe books in like somebody's kitchen, and I just became intrigued by the form of it, where you have your list of ingredients and you have your method and your preparation. And I think my mind just wanted to riff on that form. So the deep fried cheesy snacks was the first one in there. And then I began thinking like, yeah, write another one. And then, so deep fried cheesy snacks, what I loved about that was like, I think my favorite part of that, in addition to the like absurd recipe where it's like every kind of cheese and junk food you can think of deep fried, was the serving suggestion. Um, you know, what is it? Something about served with cans of Budweiser or something, served with cans of beer, and then I went like, okay, like let's make it international. So the British one where it's just all depressing, like, stir until tired, so that was sort of the thought process behind that. And my favorite was the very unhappy, God, I'm getting my own titles wrong. Uh the one about the squid. I think it's a very unpleasant squid, I think. Um I just love the idea that because it was supposed to be French, that this was going to be like an existentialist piece. This squid is no longer captain of its destiny. Chop it all up and throw it in the pan. And, the idea that it serves one under a single bare, light bulb. So it was fun. That was a really fun. I like that. I like playing with form. And the other absurdist pieces in there, one of them is like, a kind of pop quiz on math that makes no sense. It's all about elderly widows, the elderly widow problem.
Oh.
So that's another great thing that he allowed me to include those in there, even though they're not personal essays.
Yeah.
And they come as a kind of intermission, between the shorter personal essays and the long piece of appendix.
Oh, I see. Yeah, in the order that you have them in there. Now, I'm curious of any of these pieces. Was there one that was beyond difficult that you felt, I don't know if I should include this, this is too personal? Is there one that challenged you more than others to remain there because of personal reasons? Was there something that you didn't feel was humorous enough to share, or maybe you weren't balancing it just yet to get out into the public, or you felt like it challenged you?
I mean, appendix was very challenging for me because of the length of it. So the other pieces are shorter, where as a writer I can see the sort of arc of the story. So with the shorter pieces, there's a kind of thing of like, yeah, I would like to include this, that, a lot of other aspects of things, but you analogous to a short story in fiction, it's like you have to make this the most succinct you can. So a lot of stuff gets cut out. With appendix, because of the length of it, I gave myself free rein to have all of these digressions into my thoughts about the Matrix and about Kafka and all of these other aspects of my life that were not related to the main story appendix but came to mind as part of the narrative. And so that one was really difficult to structure because of the length of it. It's, even though it's only 2 weeks of my life, there's a lot going on in it. My cat is sick, and there's a lot of stuff about my marriage and my life at home. My wife is a character in that piece. And so that aspect of things where, yeah, there's things where in earlier drafts that were difficult on a personal level, because that's what you were asking about. There's a lot about, my marriage, like not super intimate, but I wanted to characterize my marriage so you understood what we're like. I've been with my wife for a long time. She's much more sensible than me. I'm very ADD. I'm very cranky, and I hope that came across in there. She's very fun, by the way. She's not just sensible, and I think that comes across too. But there was stuff related to that where I definitely let her, she read drafts and she was really generous with me about allowing so much of our lives to appear in there. There was one or two things where, she was like, I'd prefer that wasn't in there. But yeah, a lot of things did get cut out of that eventually. And I had a lot of difficult writing the middle section of that, which has a lot to do with where my cat Luna was sick, and it was a snowstorm, and I was very worried that she was going to die because she'd
Mm.
stopped eating.
Oh.
And so that section gave me the most trouble trying to balance that with the main story of my appendix surgery, and stuff was going on with that at the same time where I was supposed to go in for my follow-up appointment. I didn't want to go, partly because I'd taken all these laxatives and I didn't want to get in a taxi. So my wife and I fight about that. So figuring out the rhythm of that, how to talk about, like, on one hand, we're going through this absolute despair about our cat. And on the other hand, there's this sort of comedy going on with my wife being like, you need to go see your surgeon for your follow-up appointment. And me absolutely refusing. She's making an appointment on the phone for me. And I start yelling, did you just make an appointment? I don't want to go in, while she's on the phone with the surgeon. So that was difficult to structure. And also stuff got cut out from that. Yeah.
Oh, that sounds lovely and so rich. In particular, I think, and you might have to help me describe this a little bit more. But there's no formula for humor, of course. It's so it's so subjective. But I love this idea of just the flattening of emotions. How something that I don't want to say trivial as like the laxative thing, but the appendix just kind of leveling out and then just carrying that kind of intensity at the same time. It's a very tragic comic. I really enjoy that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I love comedy, but what I feel about it, and particularly the way it played out in Appendix, is comedy's closely connected to suffering in our lives. Like comedy and tragedy, it really is like the masks that they have in the theater, the two opposing masks, that they're joined. And so for me, like, the best comedy comes from that place. It comes from the place of like, well, this sucks. This is horrible. Later on, that could be very funny, even if what's happening is terrible. And I think that is an extraordinary gift that we have, to be able to look in the face of suffering, mortality, death, all of this stuff, and find the absurdity of it. That we live in an absurd world, that you can laugh. And there's something about that I almost feel is like, that's the compensation you get from the universe, is that you can laugh at this.
Ah, that's beautiful. Is there, I'm curious, because of the amount of time that it took to sort of gather these stories or these pieces, what were the external factors that made it difficult to write these things? Because as we're looking over a good chunk of your life here in terms of, maybe you wrote these in the 90s, maybe you wrote this one last year, were there some that stick out in terms of the external factors that were affecting you? Say early 2000s, there's a lot of stuff going on in your neck of the woods in the 2000s, and even
Definitely.
last couple of years. Do you have any specific moments that stick out in terms of you couldn't just write these things because there were so many external factors that were troubling you at the time?
Well, I think external factors certainly inform the pieces. I mean, like, the sort of most poetic piece or lyric piece in there is October's Rain, which was written when I had left the city for a little while because my dad had been sick and my dad died. And I came back and I'd sort of had to remake all my connections, so I just moved back to an apartment and I was living in the East Village. And so I think October's Rain was part of the feeling of that, was the loneliness I felt at the time of, I've just moved back in, I'm the roommate of somebody I don't really know. I think that's an experience a lot of people moving to New York have at first. So that was one piece. Appendix particularly was influenced by a lot of stuff because it was written over a few years. And during that time, Trump was elected. I was still writing it during the first year of COVID in 2020. That absolutely informed a lot of the feeling where I'm writing this piece, especially in the early months of COVID, where my wife works in a hospital She's going
Mm.
to work every day. We didn't leave the city like a lot of people did. We were here during all of that when they had
Oh,
morgue
goodness.
trucks in the street. Yeah, and
Wow.
every day you'd look at the numbers, people were dying. And of course, I was terrified that my wife was going to get sick. And at that time, people getting sick, it was like people were really dropping dead all over the place. So that was frightening. So that is also in that essay. Towards the end of it, I discuss what these coming years are going to be like. But that informs something of the tone of Appendix, what was going on outside. I had a lot of appendixes about feelings about growing older and about mortality and about
Mm.
the fragility of life, that,
Yeah.
bad things happen to your friends, they get sick, all of that kind of thing was definitely informed by COVID to some degree.
Mm. And it seems like appendix then becomes sort of a feather in the cap of this journey of essays, right? Because at the end you're sort of contextualizing everything that came before. And I feel like the stakes are way higher because there's just so much going on around you that, the futility feels a little bit heavier. The humor should feel a bit more full of relief, especially right at the
Right.
end there when you've experienced so much. I've spoken to some people who were kind of in your shoes, in New York at the time, and it just sounds so horrific. And I'm very glad that you're on the other side of it, and have found some relief because I can't imagine being in that situation. Frankly,
It was very strange. In the early months, it really felt like the world had ended, and no, and what I remember most about that year was everything changed from week to week, all year round, like where the bars and restaurants shut down, and then okay, now they're allowed to give you takeout beer, which is normally not, like in New York, that's normally not allowed, but they made that law so that the bars could stay in business. The whole thing of like going to the grocery store felt like you were entering like a radiation site where you were wearing, like, your mask and everything and
yeah.
trying to rush around, get out as quickly as possible. But the year kept changing. And I think in that last part of appendix has 5 parts. And the last part, where I summarize something about what's going to happen in the year, in that year, it was interesting because, by the summer, it had become established that you're not going to catch this by touching objects that other people have touched. That if you're outside, you're much safer, that you're very unlikely to transmit it when you're not in an enclosed space.
Hmm.
So, we began meeting with friends for picnics. And Prospect Park, which is, it's sort of like the Central Park of Brooklyn, this really beautiful park that I go running in, was just incredible during that time, where there's all these families picnicking there, these groups of kids getting high, like towards the edges of the woods. And it was like beautiful. It seemed like almost out of the 19th century. So that was happening in the middle of all of this. So there was things about that year where it felt like a different world. And we had the Black Lives Matter protests going on at the same time during that summer. Um, and that just became part of the rhythm of the city, that this is going on as well. And there was something about that as well, which I, write about a bit, where even though that came from a place of incredible pain, um, there was something joyous in the fact that that year there was all of these young people showing up for these protests to say, like, enough is enough and all of that. And it felt almost like defiant, not just of, what they were protesting, um, which, well, we know what Black Lives Matter was about. It was, about Black people dying at the hands of the police so easily all the time. But there was also a sense of, like, in the middle of, like, we defy what's going on all around us, the death that's happening, we are gathering because this is so important to us. And there was a strange joy about that, a strange, like, in the middle of all that sterility, a strange joy that young people were gathering to make their voices heard. And I don't know, there was something very beautiful about that even though there was a lot of conflict and bad things that happened in connection with that, it was actually much more peaceful than in New York City than made out. I can tell you that the first days of it were definitely a lot of clashes, but for the most part, it it wasn't the way the media made it out to be.
Yeah.
You know,
It's always difficult to ascertain the degree of intensity, when you're getting a 24/7 report that's just like, all hands on deck, everything's an emergency. But I think that context really makes it life affirming, to know that in these really difficult situations, there's people who are trying to move forward, in the best possible way with joy, with purpose, and a little bit of fire, but
yeah.
a bit of balance.
Actually, you hit on exactly the right word. There was something life affirming about it,
Yeah.
and life affirming. So there was that, and all of the people in the park, and I started riding a bicycle that year. So it was a year where people had to deal with this, but there was I think that when I use the word joy, that is what I'm speaking of, is that people found all of these ways to be life affirming during that time.
Yeah. And that's, I hope you don't mind. I've been thinking of this idea of a life well lived and what that means for a writer or a creative person, because I'm always sort of trying to mull these questions over and whether how much literary success or fame is a component of that. But for somebody like you're getting this book out, My Life of Crime, and as it stands in your life, I'm curious what that means to you to have a life well lived, not just as a writer who's putting work out into the world, but as a person who has a spouse, as a member of your community. What does that mean to you? And how does that make you a complete writer?
So I'm not sure I'm the best model for a life well lived. Like I think what comes across a lot, that's one of the ways Appendix, for example, is very revealing, and the other stories as well, like My Life of Crime, um, where I'm a very impulsive person. I drink too much. I'm very disorganized. So all of those things are part of it, and actually a lot of what, like in Clinton Street days, I abandoned an apartment because I'm 3 days behind in the rent. Clinton Street days was, my memoir of living in the East Village when I was in my 20s. So in terms of a life well lived, I'm not sure I can offer a lot of advice, because I think I'm not I think I have a very chaotic life in certain ways. But what I do think, and definitely this came out of 2020, but as I've gotten older too, one thing that's been fantastic in my life is I have terrific circle of friends, really wonderful, smart people, supportive people. I have a wonderful wife. And so I have not necessarily been like the most commercially successful person in a lot of ways at this point in my life, but the fact that I have these wonderful people in my life, there's no replacement for that. And in that sense, I do think I had a life well lived where I've been connected to so many wonderful people.
Awesome. Awesome. Now, just a couple more questions to be mindful of your time here. Now that My Life of Crime is about to go out into the world, or it's already out, right?
No, it's been out for a year now.
Okay.
It came out in 22, and so it's been out for a year.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's
it's been reviewed. Yeah.
great to hear, because I'm curious. This gives us a good enough frame of time for us to talk about how this sets up the next stage of your writing, your projects, and what else you have lined up. What did you learn from this process? Not just the writing process, but the publication of it, going out into the world, and what are you left with that you want to continue to do in the next phase of your writing or project?
Yeah. So, and so you asked sort of two parts, part
Mm-hmm.
about the writing and then the other part about actually having a book out there. So the writing part with writing Appendix, because it was the first, I'd had some longer projects that I just could not pull together that I'd worked on before Appendix. So Appendix was a big success for me, and where I began to understand how to do this, how to structure a long story, how to work with um, a lot of different moving parts in a narrative. So I have an earlier essay that I was working on for a long time. It covers some similar ground in the sense of there's some things I allude to in appendix, like when my wife and I did IVF and things like that, or various chapters of our marriage that occur before the events of appendix. That I was working on this essay about an earlier part of my life, and I have been thinking about picking that up again because I have a better idea about structure and how to deal with, your whole life is like a whole bunch of things. How do you structure that into a story? So that's on the writing angle of that. I think I did learn a lot from writing appendix. On the book angle, yeah, there was a steep learning curve with that. I didn't have much of a social media presence at all. I had a Facebook account that I never logged into, and actually after Trump was elected, I stopped logging in at all because there was just
It's
too
very
much.
smart.
Yeah, there was just too much,
Yeah.
conflict and all of that stuff, ugliness. But when I had the book out, I'm now basically on every social media platform that you can name, pretty much. And so I've still learning how to manage that because it takes time. Um, I have been learning more about just the way that when you have a book, that reviews are important and interviews like this are important. All of that, I never paid much attention to the whole publishing world in that sense. So yeah, I have learned a lot in that way too. A wonderful thing that's come out of this year, and actually a great thing that's come out through social media, is that I've met a lot of other writers. I've read a lot of books by writers that I've met. And I feel I belong to a writer's community much more than I did before. And that has been very rewarding.
That's such a gift. I mean, as you said, having that sense of community, and especially online for me, I feel like it has been a godsend, has been a blessing from the cosmos or whatever's up there, for the last couple of years.
Yeah.
Lastly, I wanted to ask you if there are any works lately that are inspiring you, that are lighting the flame again. It doesn't have to be books, but just any kind of media or storytelling experience. What are you experiencing right now that is uplifting you creatively?
In terms of, so we're speaking in terms of books, maybe, or what are you thinking about
Books,
here,
movies,
Jaime?
music, visual art.
So yeah, oh yeah, well, all of those things are really important to me. Man, that is actually a tough question. I've read so many good books this year. There's an essayist I really like named Melissa McCarthy, who does something very different than what I do. She doesn't write memoirs, but she wrote a book called Shark Surfer's Death, I believe is the title. It was terrific, where she's just a person who weaves together a lot of different ideas, and I really like that. And she has a new book which I haven't read yet, but this just came out. Actually, this book was published with the same press as me, which is called Photo Phyto Proto Nitro. And I'm really looking forward to that. So Melissa McCarthy is an interesting writer. Uh, um, I recently, a friend of mine wrote a great book. My friend David Winter wrote a great book called Master Lovers, which was about his his great aunt, who had been a publicist for the Philharmonic, but he found all these love letters from the 30s after she died.
Oh, wow.
And he began to try to reconstruct who are these people. And some of them were actually pretty famous, and some of them had kind of very sketchy past. So those things are adjacent to the genre I write in, but very different than my personal essays. So that has been interesting, reading things like that. Yeah, so TV shows. I watch a lot of TV. I mentioned in the book a lot is although this is not new, is the show The Leftovers, the HBO show. That really spoke to me. And in fact, while working on Appendix, I listen to the soundtrack to The Leftovers. It has a great soundtrack, often while writing, because I wanted that spooky feeling in my mind of the world is ending, and the sense of the world is a dangerous, mysterious place, and all that is given to us is to experience it. And something of that feeling I wanted in me while I was writing it, even though the stakes are not so high in appendix about, I had routine surgery, but I wanted that feeling of living in a mysterious world while I was writing.
Awesome. Now, is there anything else that you'd like us to know about My Life of Crime, Essays, and Other Entertainments?
It's very funny. And I think it's very readable. I actually, the thing I think most about it, in some ways, taken as a whole collection, it is a kind of love letter to my life in New York City. It is all about what it's like to live in New York City, the frustrations of it, the beauty of it, and most of all, the people. There's in appendix, particularly, but all throughout the collection, you interact with all different kinds of people in New York City, from all different ethnic backgrounds, from all different life situations. And you ride with them on the subway, and every single day I will have a conversation with a stranger. Seriously, every day. So every day I'm talking with somebody that I've never met before. And so I think that quality comes across in the whole collection of, I am a creature of the city, and even though life in New York is really, it is difficult to live here. You live in tiny spaces, it's expensive, and there's all sorts of things about it that are miserable. And yet there's this, where you just meet all of these people doing their own thing. And there's something about that where I really love that, it's like living in the center of humanity in that way. So in a way, that's what the book is about.
Beautiful, remarkable note to end on.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Tyler, This has been such a pleasure, and I can't wait to read the rest of this collection, My Life of Crime. I hope that folks go check it out, and I'm going to have the link in the episode description. But I do hope that we get to catch up again, because I'm just scratching the surface with you. I don't, sometimes I don't even know where to begin, because there's so much happening here. But this has been such a treat, and I do hope that we get to chat again down the road.
I would love that, Jaime. I had a great time talking to you. You're a great interview, and I really enjoyed being here. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Well, I will be in touch on the internet. I'll let you enjoy your Sunday, but please take care and have a happy new year. Belated.
Yeah, happy new year to you. Take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.